this evening. It's my pleasure to be here in beautiful Kilmore Quay in conversation with one of our greatest writers, a writer who's described by the Washington Post as one of the greatest stylists alive. And I think Tessa Hadley truly is an inheritor of Elizabeth Bowen. Anne Enright, writing in The Guardian, says this: her prose manages a strange trick of pre-existence. From the very first line, it is as though you have known and liked her work for a very long time. Enright also says it's as though 19th century values about the proper use of intelligence, perhaps, and of conversation have been applied to contemporary ideas about desire. She's right. There is an electrifying, subversive, unexpected undercurrent to all of the stories and novels of Tessa Hadley, who is again, like Bowen, one of those rare writers equally at home in the forms of the novel as the short story. For me, the great luxury of our time together this evening is that we're not tied to talking about or promoting one particular book, and so we're free to talk in a wider sweep about all of Tessa's writing and about Tessa Hadley as a writer. We will leave time for questions at the end, so for the last 10 to 15 minutes there's going to be a roving mic, and so if you have anything to ask Tessa, get your question sharp and we'll come to you. I'd like to read what the Guardian critic Rachel Cook said when the news broke that Tessa had been awarded the Wyndham Campbell Prize in 2016. Cook said, "She deserves all the prizes. Hadley is psychologically acute, dryly witty, and whether describing a red brick suburb or a sopping country afternoon, she is absolutely wonderful on place. Her relative obscurity, then, is an unfathomable mystery, even if I know deep down she's likely just another victim of a literary culture that tends to prize the male over the female, the grandly thematic over the so-called domestic. The female characters at the heart of her novels, clever, impulsive, not always wholly likeable, are so finely drawn I can never get them out of my head. Even now, whenever I see a train bound for Cardiff, I picture Kate, the heroine of her third novel, The Master Bedroom. What is she doing these days, I think to myself? Is she sleeping with yet another unsuitable man?" I love that, but I think, Tessa, what I most particularly love is that no one would call you a relatively obscure writer anymore. I think the efflorescence of your work in the last decade has been extraordinary, and yet I think you still are abidingly a writer's writer, which I mean is the highest compliment, and by which I mean you are a writer whom other writers admire, whom other writers love. And I wanted to begin this evening by asking you about one of the writers you most admire. I've mentioned her twice already, and I've only been talking a few minutes, Elizabeth Bowen. Can you tell us something about your love? You edited Elizabeth Bowen's most recent Selected for Vintage with a beautiful introduction. Can you tell us about discovering Bowen?
I found Elizabeth Bowen, who really is one of my absolute touchstones. She's one of the writers that when I sit down on a morning, not early because I'm definitely an owl, not a lark, let's say at about 11 o'clock, and I have to cross the threshold out of ordinary life, breakfast, tea, granola, domestic, and I have to cross over into that extraordinary place that fiction making is. And I have a writer there beside me on the table to just read. Sometimes it's just a couple of sentences, or maybe it's a paragraph. And Bowen has always been, for me, from the beginning, one of those. The others, perhaps, are Anita Bruckner, Alice Munro, sometimes Colm Tóibín, helped me out of a tight spot with his sentences. But Bowen, my acquaintance with her, which is, of course, not in life, but only in writing, although our lives overlap, but I never met her or was in a room with her. It came from very young, when aged about 14, I think, I promoted myself. I write something about this in that introduction you mentioned.
You promote yourself up the 3 yellow laminate steps into the adult section.
Exactly. Yeah. I decided I needed adult reading, and I walked up 3 steps into the adult section of the library with no clues as to where to start. I came from a family that liked books, but they weren't literary. They didn't have a sort of established taste, all sorts of stuff on our shelves. And I was drawn to the people who had collected works, because I hoped it would be like Swallows and Amazons, and things would work in a series, or Little House in the Woods, or those other children's series that I loved. And I loved the woodcuts on the front of the old Elizabeth Bowen. She got rather fed up with them in time and said she didn't want any more of them, but I found them very evocative. And then I would take her books out, I would take them home, and I hadn't a clue what was going on in them. I knew where Ireland was, but what was the politics? What was the class? What was the world? How could I read it? I do remember particularly people got dressed for dinner, and I did wonder, what were they wearing before they got dressed for dinner? But I actually think that's how you learn to read. I think it's how you learn to read literature, but I actually think it's how you learn to read life. You first of all get the signs and the pictures and the words, and then somewhere after them experience comes and knowledge comes. But even though I hardly knew what was happening in her books, I knew that I loved some promise in the density of her sentences that I think a child needs this. Life was as complicated as I imagined it was. A lot of the words that come to us as children are thin and weak and disappointing, and it's the great writers who bring us the promise that no, everything you feel as a child is born out, actually, in the depths of adult life. And she was one of those, even long before I really knew what was happening, or who loved who, or why they died, or any of it.
So when you say you have Bowen on your desk, and when you say she's a writer who's incredibly important to you, do you read Bowen to tune into a particular sensibility? Do you do it for the rhythms of her prose? Or there's one of your novels, The Past, which consciously takes the structure of a Bowen novel. We have the present, the past, the present.
Yeah.
And are you reading Bowen? How acquisitively are you reading her?
Yeah, I know, it's so complicated, isn't it? I think when you're learning to write, more than I realised even while I was doing it, copying is really invaluable. And when I was teaching, I don't actually teach at Bath Spa anymore, I retired a few years ago, but I used to get my students to go and copy, write a page like Elizabeth Bowen, write a page like J.M. Coetzee, write a page like Colm Tóibín. And one of the things I would say was, it will change what you write, but no one will think it's actually like Elizabeth Bowen. They won't, it'll be like you. So I think copying is where you start. But of course you can't finish there. To do a pastiche of a Bowen sentence, what sounds sophisticated and magnificent in her would sound artificial and phony and put on in me. So it's it's almost like a permission to imagine and dream. That's what you're reading for, because you have really been thinking granola, tea, washing machine, and it's a permission to go into a bigger place and sit up. We both sat up.
We both sat up, didn't we?
Yeah.
We both, what is it? We were...
Exactly, do that.
Yeah.
And it's also a test, a standard. Be this good. You probably can't, but be it. Try, be this good. Don't waste a word. Don't say anything twice. Don't mess around. Don't be shallow or cheap. So I think it's those two things, one of which inspires you and moves you into another space, and the other one of which kind of insists that you push when you're there.
I love that. I'm thinking, Tessa, of you reading Bowen as, when you strike a tuning fork.
Yeah.
And suddenly everything sort of shivers into alignment. Something like that.
Something like that, absolutely.
Something like that.
Absolutely.
So with another of the writers on your desk, I know, is Alice Munro.
Yeah.
And there was something you talk about being overlapping with Bowen, but never being in the same room as her. And something that I find infinitely precious happened when I teach a masterclass in the short story, and you very kindly, you guest tutored for me. And you took a masterclass on Alice Munro, and about a week later, Alice Munro died. And I emailed my students and I told them, I hope you realize how lucky you are because you have a thread, a psychic thread that connects you to Alice Munro via Tessa Hadley while she was still living in this world.
Amazing, uncanny.
And then Tessa, you wrote this beautiful piece that anyone can read online in The Stinging Fly about Alice Munro and why she was so important to you. And you analyse the little pile of dead flies. Tell us about the little pile of dead flies.
What am I going to remember what the name of that story is?
Powers.
Powers, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And I thought afterwards I should have made more of that word, powers. Mm-hmm. And it's a weird story. I wouldn't say it's a sublime Alice Munro story. It's a bit all over the place, and yet I love it. It's funny, when you really adore a writer, you sometimes find you love tenderly their not the superb pieces that hit every bit right, but the pieces that seem suggestive and open up infinitely. And this piece is about it ends up being about a woman who has vague sixth sense. She can tell where a lost object is. She ends up in a tawdry sort of circus life in the 1920s, am I remembering it right, I think, when she can do mind reading, and it becomes just a trick. And it feels like both her own emotional life and her magic have lost their power. And I always thought that was Alice Munro writing about that little bit in between being clever, intelligent, knowing things, and then that magic leap into imagining, which has nothing to do with being clever, intelligent, knowing things. That other bit where by some magic you can be somewhere, you can see something, and you know what he thought, you know what she saw, you know what the room smells like, and you don't know how you know it. And this woman in the story is at the end of her powers. Something awful is about to happen to her. Her husband is about to commit her to a mental hospital. The papers are in his pocket. But she walks into a hotel room, a dingy, sordid hotel room, and she knows, without looking, that an ugly little pile of dead flies is on the windowsill behind the dressing table. And she knows that her power is still there. And I do think there is something of the charlatan in realist fiction, where you, by some weird occult power, you can dream up things in spaces.
Yes, and I'm fascinated, Tessa, because this is one of the things that you do so particularly well. And I often think, with my, you get students to write a passage, like with writers they like, I do the same. And I always think the writers you feel drawn to, there is something that you have, there's a frequency, there's a resonance. And I think this, with Munro, it seems to me you absolutely share that. And I think of something that Garcia Marquez says, where he says, in journalism, one erroneous fact is enough for the whole house of cards to topple. But in fiction, all you need is one true detail for the reader to believe the whole thing. Yeah. And I wanted to know, in your new novella, forthcoming novella that we're going to talk about, one detail that I absolutely loved, the mother is sitting knitting, and when she finishes a row, I actually got a detention in school for not being able to knit, so this is a very bad impression of someone knitting, but when she finishes a row, she takes a knitting needle and she greases it in her hair, and her grown-up daughters are appalled at this. And it's that sort of detail. Instantly, I believe her, I believe her daughters, I believe the world. I can feel the texture of the jumper she's knitting to her. I don't even, tell us, how does that magic work, and where do those details come from?
Well, that novella is a funny product because a lot of it does come from my mother's life. And my grandmother, who I remember very well, who died when I was 10, did used to, at the end of every row, put her knitting needle in her hair to grease the needle. So I suppose,
but still, it's never enough for something to have happened for it to be real in fiction. Yeah. So what is it that makes you alight on that detail, or invent the dead flies, or?
And I have no answer to that. I don't know. It's funny because my cousin, who read some of that novella, and some of it is borrowed from our two mothers and their mother, our grandmother, our family life. But he said, how do you select what you use? He's got too much. He doesn't know which to, and I don't have an answer to that question, because I'm not thinking about that greasing of the needle. I didn't know I remembered it until I came to that moment in the writing, and I saw her. So I don't know. I don't know how. One has a rag and bone shop, as Yeats says, a rag and bone shop of the heart, in which 1,000 fragments are collected, and they're all trivial. No, they're not all trivial. Some of them are trivial, and some of them are big and huge and full of pain or joy or whatever. And I don't know how the selection happens at the moment of sitting there with the computer, but that's
I always think it's like
magic.
Magnetic filings or something.
Yeah, that's
I always
good.
feel if I'm writing something of the story, if you're doing it right, if the frequency of it is right, if the sort of physics of it is right, things get magnetized and it accrues things.
Absolutely right. And your tuning fork image that you used earlier, I've used sometimes for when you strike one note in a story and it's as if other notes that you didn't know were there, they start to sing out and you know how to use them as they come.
Yes.
But this is all, it sounds mystical, but it is strangely mysterious as one writes.
Well,
I can remember when I was 20, sitting with friends doing something really unforgivable, sitting round and making up the future lives of some of our other friends who, needless to say, weren't present. And we said, this will happen to him, this will happen to her. I can imagine her doing this, driving a big van, having lots of kids, running a health centre. Now, those things didn't come true. It wasn't that we didn't have the gift of sixth sight or whatever. But that magnetic, the thing that the personality of someone you're imagining attracts to itself, the right possibilities, that's something that is, I think it's present in human imagination, and then it's just that writers specialise in that, if you like. But I think lots of people, not everybody has it, but lots of people have it.
Yes.
And they do that imagining about others. That's empathy, isn't it, partly?
I want to ask you a question that's a bit less mystical, but still very important, which is, just after Alice Munro died, it suddenly came out in the news, her daughter, Andrea Robin Skinner, talked very publicly and openly about her childhood of sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, about which it transpired Alice Munro knew. Now, my students, I'd emailed them saying, are you aware you've had this incredibly important... They were suddenly reeling, and you had opened them up to Munro, those who knew her, those who didn't, and they were emailing me saying, what do we do? How do we read Munro? Here's a writer that we love, and now these revelations have come out. How do we still love her? How do we, fold into our knowledge of these stories, our knowledge of the... And I suppose it's the old question of separating the writer from the art. But I wanted to know, especially as Munro is a writer who's so beloved by you, she's a writer for me, who's very important. How do we work our way through that thicket? How have you?
It's such a sad story. I'm so sorry. I'm so sad for her daughter, primarily, of course. A bit sad for her. That's horrible. She was quite an old lady when she heard that story, and who knew so many Munro stories about bad mothers who are not good for their children? So many stories about abject women who do terrible things to keep their men. Yeah. Who knew?
Stories about daughters who take their own lives rather than have their mothers ashamed.
Yeah. Who needs their writers to be good? When did that start? What we need is our writers to see truly, and you can see truly about terrible things in yourself and in the life close around you. That's. I don't know whether that's an adequate answer. I don't suppose it would for her daughter be an adequate answer for a moment.
No, I think that's the only. I think I gave a version of that. I think I gave to my students.
I do think it's all there in Munro's stories. I mean, not directly, not in an autobiographical way, but that particularly, I mean, it's one of her fascinating themes, is that objection of women. which seems to me belongs to her generation. She's absolutely the same age as my mother was. And that sense of very complicated, very powerful, very intelligent women, putting all of that in the service of men who are flawed, who do bad things, and that story is a rich and fascinating one to tell, and I think Munro tells it very explicitly, and that helps one understand what happened in that dreadful transaction when she didn't side with her daughter, as every moral textbook would tell you she should have done, and instead decided to stay with her husband.
One thing I always loved about Munro the person is that she always said she would do all of her writing and she would have dinner on the table for the children. I mean, and that now sounds terribly sad, but I've always thought, that's what I do. I drop my children at school, I do my writing, and then I pick them up, and I'm a mum. And I always liked that Munro was a model of a writer who did that. And one of the things, Tessa, I love in your work is the way that you have written, often in a very unexpected and again subversive way, about motherhood and about desire. And I wanted to ask about how you started out, because you were a mum, a happy mum of children, but you were writing and writing and writing, writing while the children were at school or creche, and not getting published until you were mid-40s. Can you talk a little bit about what life was like then, what it was that what that compulsion was? It
was a kind of insanity. I mean, it didn't feel great at the time. It felt complicated. I had had a proper job, briefly, as a school teacher, which I was completely hopeless at, failed at disastrously, got pregnant aged 24 or 23 to get out of. So it was a humiliating history of failure, really. And then thought it's better being at home with the kids than giving myself to teaching, my husband was a teacher, a very good teacher, and I was surrounded by very good school teachers who were fabulous at doing it, and I knew it took your whole commitment, and I didn't have that. So then I was at home with my kids, enjoying it and sometimes not enjoying it the way you do. And I was just writing like a mad thing and failing over and over, not just failing to be published. I didn't really know how to try to be published, but I tried a bit. I tried my best. But actually, I was just writing bad books, so I'm so thankful I wasn't published now, but then I wasn't thankful, and feeling it was very painful. And the only explanation I can give for persevering is a kind of madness, a bitterness that I used to feel, and I probably still feel, that if I can't write, I'm not completely alive. Isn't that so bizarre? And that has nothing to do with most people. That's a strange thing that fell upon me, and I hope it leaves me at some point, because at some point I probably won't be able to write anymore, and I hope I'll be making dinner parties like Alice Munro kept saying she was going to do, and decorating the house or gardening or something awful like that.
I think there is something so interesting about that sense of fantasy life, and where does it go? And it's certainly something that, when I had my children are now 7 and 10, so they're a little bit older, but when they were babies and I was looking after them full-time by choice, kind of a bit financial necessity, but mainly choice, you are caught in such an endless present tense of responding to their needs and the routine.
You've just washed up the breakfast
where does
and
the rest
put
of
the
it...
washing in the machine, and it's lunchtime. How did that happen?
And yet I had this. And I had published young as a writer, which
I know
in
you
retrospect
have the
is
opposite
not the
story.
Dream.
You have the other story.
But I feel that I only really found my voice, or what I would consider my voice, after I had had children, when I was writing out of such an urgency. And there was something you said in an interview with Deborah Treisman, the editor of The New Yorker. I think that you said your fantasy life stopped when you became a published writer. And I thought that's kind of as if that extraordinary surplus of the life, of the mind, when you started publishing books, that was its purpose. That was where it needed to be funneled.
I've never known whether that that happened to me. It was extraordinary. I used to be a daydreamer all the time, incessantly. And then, in my mid-40s, it just stopped, and I don't really do it anymore. Now, was that the menopause, an age, or was it being published and feeling that my writing, more than being published even, feeling the writing was truthful for the first time? So I have no idea.
Can you remember the first, you were writing, can you remember the first thing that felt real, true?
Yeah, I can.
Can you tell us?
A couple of short stories that I wrote that actually have never been collected, but I wrote them for a little Welsh press, because I've spent most of my adult life in Cardiff in Wales. And I just knew there was one story where it wasn't a story about me, a story of a young girl who has a baby by a Polish older married man, and she's pushing this baby along what I sort of imagine as Newport Road in Cardiff, horrible, great big trafficky road, and it's filthy and dark, and it starts to snow. And I can just remember writing that and thinking, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. I know how to tell this story. I'm inside it. Now, it seems mad that I'd written 4 novels while never feeling that, 4 failed novels, but...
Could you see it? Could you feel it? Was it a tingle on your spine? What was it?
It was my terrain. I had been faking it. I was a great fan of, let's say, Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee, huge for me in the 70s and 80s. It was funny, much earlier you talked about being in a room with, and I did have an actual experience of being in the back of a radio studio when someone was interviewing, my cousin was interviewing Nadine Gordimer, and I said, can I come along and just sit there? And I remember the magic of a person of power. That's a complete distraction from what we're talking about. So I'd been trying to write big global political novels. I'd written one. It's funny, this is very much in the news at the moment, isn't it? About French New Caledonia, where they sent all their political prisoners after 1870. I mean, it sounds like a Booker Prize winner, doesn't it? But hell, I couldn't write it. It was awful. I was trying to write those big global novels, and it was as if I just accepted my ambition shrank in a way. It came home, and I thought, I know about a girl. I'm not her, but I know about a girl pushing a baby in a pushchair up that road, and it started to snow, and the baby sees snow for the first time, which actually I've just used again in what I'm writing now, funnily enough. I've just thought of that. I used a baby seeing snow for the first time.
Can we hear something you're going to read for us from a short story?
Yeah. Okay, so this is from my last collection, which was published, I never remember when I published, a couple of years ago, called After the Funeral. But this is from a short story called Funny Little Snake, and because I'm just going to read from the very beginning, you don't need to know anything, you should be able to pick it all up. Funny Little Snake. The child was 9 years old and couldn't fasten her own buttons. Valerie knelt in front of her on the carpet in the spare room, and Robin held out first one cuff and then the other without a word, then turned around to present the back of her dress, where a long row of spherical chocolate brown buttons was unfastened over a grubby white petticoat edged with lace. The skinny, tiny shoulder blades flickered with repressed movement. And although every night since Robin had arrived a week ago, Valerie had encouraged her into a bath foamed up with bubbles, she still smelled of something furtive, musty spice from the back of a cupboard. The smell must be in her dress, which Valerie didn't dare wash because it looked as though it had to be dry cleaned, or in her skin, or in her lank, licorice-coloured hair, which was pushed back from her forehead under an even grubbier stretch Alice band. Trust Robin's mother to have a child who couldn't do up buttons and then put her into a fancy plaid dress with hundreds of them, and frogging, and leg of mutton sleeves like a Victorian orphan, instead of ordinary slacks and a t-shirt so that she could play. The mother went around, apparently, in long dresses and bare feet, and had her picture painted by artists. Robin at least had come wearing tights and plimsolled shoes with elastic tops, though her green coat was too thin for winter weather. Valerie had tried to talk to her stepdaughter. It was the first time they'd met, and she'd braced herself for resentment, the child's mind poisoned against her. Robin was miniature, a doll with a plain, pale, wide face, her temples blue-veined where her hair was strained back, her wide-open grey eyes affronted and evasive and set too far apart. She wasn't naughty, and she wasn't actually silent. That would have been a form of stubbornness to combat, to coax and manoeuvre round. She was a nullity, an absence, answering yes and no obediently if she was questioned in that languid drawl that was somehow so offensive, though Valerie knew the accent wasn't the child's fault, only what she'd learned. Robin even said please and thank you, and she told Valerie the name of her teacher. But when Valerie asked whether she liked the teacher, Valerie, hadn't liked her own teachers much when she was at school. Her look slipped away uneasily from her stepmother's, and she shrugged as if such an idea as liking or not liking hadn't occurred to her. The only dislikes she was definite about had to do with eating. When Valerie put fish pie on Robin's plate on the first night, she shot her a direct look of such piercing desperation. She hardly ever actually appealed or asked for anything. That Valerie, who was a good, wholesome cook and had been going to insist, asked her kindly what she ate at home. Eggs, cottage pie, baked beans. Honestly, the girl hardly seemed to know the names of things. Toast was all she could think of. Definitely not eggs, a vehement headshake. Toast and, after long consideration, then murmuring hesitantly, tonelessly, tomato soup, cornflakes, butterscotch instant whip.
Lovely, thank you. Actually, Tessa, before you put your book down, will you pick it up and just read us that first sentence again? Just that first sentence.
You need my glasses, of course, because I should know my own work off by heart, but one doesn't. The child was 9 years old and couldn't fasten her own buttons.
Okay, so what I want to ask you, one of the things I most love about your work is you write this extraordinary, supple third-person consciousness that can go right inside its narrators, its protagonists, and go outside, and it's absolutely flawless. And I wanted us to hear that sentence again, because it seems to me that in that sentence, it sounds as if we're just hearing fact, objective fact, but we're actually hearing subjective judgment.
Yeah, we're hearing Valerie, who's thinking, the child is 9 years old, couldn't fasten her own buttons. Yeah, so that's...
Can you talk about how, I know you wrote a PhD on Henry James, you know, and his use of the third person, and can you talk about when you're inhabiting a character, where are you, Tessa Hadley, and when do you presume to articulate things for them, and when do you drop into their consciousness? Is that instinctive?
Is it instinctive? No, I don't think it's instinctive. I think it's learned, and I guess James is in there somewhere, the obvious person that gets credited with that, which is called free and direct style, as you well know, Lucy, which is where it seems to be the narrator speaking, but it's fairly obvious that it's sort of coming from inside one of the characters' head. Is Flaubert gets attributed with that, that's the right word. But I think Jane Austen invented it. I see it everywhere in Jane Austen, and you can feel it in Sense and Sensibility. Most of it's written in a rather authoritative, Samuel Johnson-esque sort of prose, telling you what it is, and that this girl is silly, and this one's sensible, and this is how you should think. And then there are scenes where she's finding her way into the great Jane Austen style that the rest of the books are going to come in, where she can just fall in one sentence from being bossy and opinionated and having thoughts about her characters, which is great because she's very perceptive and very intelligent, and she can then fall inside the head of one of her characters and give you a sentence that is from inside. And I just think that tool for a writer which is maybe a bit unfashionable at the moment, that tool of being both God and subject and moving freely at will, as long as the prose will take it, between one and the other, is such an opportunity of richness for writing, because you can do everything with it. You can have the overshot, the shot that says, here are these 6 people in a room, they look like this is what they're doing, and this is how they appear, like in a film. And then, as only a novel can do, you deep dive into one mind, and you can just give a few moments of what's she feeling and what does she think. There's a lovely moment in Mansfield Park where lovely, quiet Fanny is watching her horse being used for Mary Crawford, who's glamorous and sexy and naughty, for Mary's riding lessons. And Jane Austen, who's 1 minute being Jane Austen and very wry at the expense of everybody, falls inside Fanny's suppressed inner complaint at the unfairness of this. And it's just a beautiful piece of writing.
So when you're writing a story like that, you know your characters. Your characters are so real, it feels that you know them intimately. Do you think about them? Do you pretend you are them, walking along until you know them? Do you let them talk in your head?
Well, that's obviously the fantasy bit, isn't it?
That's the fantasy bit, yeah.
There are always some characters you can't do. I don't know whether you recognise that. And I've made mistakes with books. The first draft of Master Bedroom, actually, it was lovely that Rachel Cook liked Master Bedroom, which I'm not happy about. But when I first wrote that, I had 2 of the characters thinking and feeling, and I just realised that was so fake. I couldn't do them. I knew how they were powerful, but I didn't know how they were inside much more effectively. Then I changed it, by the way. I rewrote it, and I just had them seen from the outside. In my novel, The Past, I have a very important character, a sort of catalyst for everything that happens, is a glamorous Argentinian lawyer. I have no idea what is inside a glamorous Argentinian lawyer, but I know how she would walk and move, and how terrifying she would be, and how compelling and how potent inside this rather sort of scruffy, bourgeois, lefty, intellectual English family. So I keep her. I never go inside her head. No, I just have her effect as she walks through the house, as she moves, as she speaks, on all the others, and all the others talking about her and thinking about her. So there's definitely a divide between those characters you can see and watch, and those characters where you can fall inside their thoughts.
And you tend to set your work within your lifetime, within, say, maybe memory, within 1 or 2 generations memory.
Yeah.
What's the earliest? I can't think that you've gone earlier than 1920s.
No earlier than that. I have written one story about, funnily enough, sounds very uncharacteristic, but a shipwreck in the 1920s. And the reason I dared to do that is because my grandfather, not a wholly lovable man, but he was a ship's boy, a cabin boy, and he wrote a very self-serving but fascinating memoir, never published or anything, which I have. And so he gave the most brilliant, exactly what a writer would want, all the details of that shipwreck where he was shipwrecked off Vancouver Island.
But you've never been tempted to, say, read up on, I suppose you were, French Caledonia, and it wouldn't come to life for you.
And it came out dead. I read everything about, all the wonderful leaders of the Paris Commune were exiled there, the ones that weren't shot were exiled to New Caledonia. The great feminist Louise Michel, you could see it really is a Booker Prize winner, was exiled to New Caledonia and got involved in indigenous uprisings in that island. It's made for a story. But I was fake. I was a fake. I was a fake writing it. I don't know. I know there are some great books totally set in a time, Penelope Fitzgerald writing Blue Flower, late 18th century Germany. Yeah. I don't know how that's done. I know it can be done, but I can't do it.
So let's talk about the difference then between novels and stories, which you can do. 8 novels, 4 story collections. Does that suggest that stories are harder?
No, I don't. I don't know what it suggests. I don't know whether maybe they are. I don't know which is harder. They're both hard. They're differently hard.
Yeah.
A novel is hard slog. a novel is muscle work and real deliberate. There's something more deliberate about writing a novel. Does that sound right to you?
How much do you plan before you start actually writing a novel? How much of the fantasy world of it, the daydreaming, have you done? How much do you know the milestones or know the end?
I think when I was writing those failure novels, I wasn't planning much. I was hoping for the best. I actually thought writing a novel was a bit like reading one. So I would say, I wonder what happens next. Which is, so when the first time I was writing something that was any good, I very much planned it. I had to, not plan, not horrible, like on a post-it note or something. But in my mind, I knew where it was going. But I think I'm relaxing. I'm a little bit more able to trust myself. Not planning down to the last detail, because I think making a plan for a book, a good plan, it's like being given a map of the terrain. Then someone drops you in the terrain. The map does not relate to the jungle you're hacking your way through, or the townships you come across, or the people. It's just, but it gives you, I'm going there. That's where I'm writing towards. Oh, I've got that bit. I know that I know that moment's going to come, and I know that she's going to have a baby, and I know that at the end I'm going to finish with those two. So they're like landmarks or points plotted on a map.
How often do you work with a sort of a structure like the past, where you have present, past, present, which is a very deliberate structure?
But in that novel, not at all. I actually, what I was longing to do was write intensely about 3 weeks of holiday and just have people talking, relating, and I got to the middle and I had a complete catastrophe. I thought, this is boring, it's going soggy, it's all wrong, it doesn't feel right. And I had a sort of fortnight of misery, then in the bath one afternoon, obviously nothing else to do while I couldn't write. I thought I got the whole thing, and I knew we would drop back into the past in the middle. So that was an improvisation born of necessity, because the novel was sagging in the middle. It needed something to hold it up like a tent pole. But late in the day, which is quite a complicated structure, with a sort of every other part is the present day, which begins with the death of one of 4 close friends, and then I go back into the past. That was very carefully plotted. I knew that before I started, and that arose out of the nature of the story. I thought, I want to keep these 4 close friends together through all the phases of their youth and middle age. I want all kinds of crisscrossing and naughty sort of connections to happen.
And slipping of power dynamics.
Yes, exactly that. But I have to have a big thing, and I knew it would be a death, and I knew it would be Zachary, because he's the nicest and writers are cruel. But I knew I couldn't have that happen 3/4 of the way through. So I knew I had to start with that. And then the structure arose from that. So there's no fixed answer.
So when you're writing a short story, do you feel freer to, I think of Claire Keegan, who might talk about writing a first draft of a story like freewheeling down a hill on a bicycle, not knowing where she'll end up. Which I always think is slightly, Claire Keegan is such a precise writer, and she talks about choosing so carefully. She has a brilliant phrase that I love, the incisions in time, where you cut in, where you cut out.
So true of her marvellous stories.
Yeah, so how do you get that balance between that control and that wild freedom?
It's the balance you have to find, and I think every writer finds it differently, actually. And I do pick up from Claire, who's a marvel, that she writes over and over and over and over. I don't know how much her drafts change, but I suspect to make all that reworking worthwhile a lot. And Alice Munro certainly wrote fragments and didn't know what order they happened in. But for some reason, it sounds slightly depressing, but I tend to write very consecutively, and a very finished version doesn't mean it can't then be changed. So, it doesn't ruin anything. It is still just the map, and I actually get excited. I feel that thing's coming, where I can write that scene I've been waiting to do, and I don't know what it's going to be like. Although I know what the scene is, but I don't know what it's going to be like.
Well, I want to ask you what the short story is for you, because Bowen describes it. You quote Bowen in your introduction to her selected, saying that the novel is, social realism and blah, The story is Immortal Longings.
Immortal Longings.
I love that.
I love that.
So for Bowen, the short story is the place for immortal longings.
Yeah.
What is it for you?
Do you know, I'm not sure I can answer. I don't know why. It's absolutely definite that some material comes and is a short story, and some is a... Why that little story, Funny Little Snake, about the sort of unhappy little kid and the reluctant stepmother, and why wasn't that a novel? I feel as if a gift is given you, a germ of the story, and you sort of have a hunch as to how much meat is in it. Mm-hmm. You have to be careful with a novel, that there's enough in it. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want to overstretch your material to be too thin.
Yeah.
And that's something like that deliberateness and slight muscle work that you need for a novel. You need to think, I can take it over here, and I can take that over there, and then I can take that there, and then they can meet. And a short story comes in one great, like a hot coal that you hold in your hand for as long as you can write it, and then it's done.
Yes, I love that. We'll come to questions in just a minute, but now, talking about short stories and novels, but you've written a novella. So where did that idea, that form come from?
It's so mundane where it came from. It came from my publisher saying, why don't you write a novella? And I absolutely never listen to what anybody says. And I said, oh, no, I've never written one, I don't think. And I just went home and I thought of it like that. And it does come, it's inspired by... My mother died, and I was last year, and I was thinking, she was very old, she was 92, and I was thinking about, it doesn't seem that old to me now, actually, but I was thinking about her youth, as I'd always thought about her youth. She talked about her youth as an art student in Bristol a lot. And the novella and thoughts about my mum and her sister came together. It's not her story, I've made loads of it up. But somewhere, the sense of the spirit of that moment in the 1950s, of young girls full of life and full of ignorance and full of just doing such dangerous things, it was all in me, and it fell into a sort of a novella type pattern.
Yeah, it's a beautiful novella. It's a very ardent novella.
That's a lovely word.
Will you read us a little bit of it? Would you like to borrow my copy? You've got your own.
I've found my page in here, so I haven't got proof. It's got a lovely... When it does come out, it's going to have a lovely cover. I'm really excited.
It has a sort of Eric Ravilius style.
She's a contemporary painter. I've forgotten her name momentarily, but it's of a sort of arched window with snow falling outside. It's very lovely. So this is from... The novella falls into 3 chapters, and it's kind of about the girls emerging into their love life. But the middle chapter is at home with their mother, who is not quite my grandmother, of course, but she greases her knitting needles in her hair. And this is the end of that chapter. What we know is that the parental marriage is falling apart, and the girls know that their father has a girlfriend. It's all a bit... It's not spoken about much. It's all a bit furtive and shameful and dreadful, and the home has got that tension in it. But he is taking her out. He's in the Bristol Avonmouth Port Authority, and he's taking her out to a do that evening, his wife, their mother. And the 2 girls, who are sort of 20 and 18, the older Moira is an art student, and Evelyn is studying French at the university. They are dressing their mother up to look good. And I'm just reading the end of the middle chapter of the novella. It's set in about 1950-ish. Their mother put on the blue dress Moira had made her, with an A-line brocade skirt and velvet bodice, cut with a draped neck and 3/4 sleeves. Inevitably, the strap on her petticoat was broken. Moira had to lend her a safety pin. They sat her down at the walnut veneer dressing table in her bedroom. "Old fright," she said, gazing mercilessly at her reflection, but coquetting her head on her neck nonetheless out of habit. She wasn't really old. She was 43, but that seemed old enough to her daughters, their youthful beauty crowded into the reflection in the mirror beside hers, affecting not to look at themselves, only stealing side glances. Then Moira took her mother's face between her hands and turned it toward her, bringing her own face close so that they mirrored each other, each unconsciously mimicking the other's expression. Catching the tip of her tongue between her teeth in concentration, Moira smoothed basic dew onto her mother's worn cheeks, then powdered them and gave them a faint touch of colour, penciling in the arch of her eyebrows and painting her eyes with eyeliner and mascara. "Not too much," Rose anxiously said. "Trust me, it won't be too much." Working tenderly around her wedding ring, Evelyn rubbed lotion into those hands which still smelled of cooking, then painted her mother's nails absorbedly with cherry ripe. They all three had the same small hands and feet, bony and fine, but the skin on Rose's hands was growing loose. They searched in the dressing table drawer for her green enamelled necklace and matching earrings. Her jewellery case was jumbled in with her girdles and stockings and brassiers and spectacles and used ration books, night dresses and knitted bed jackets, old letters and postcards and handkerchiefs and hairpins and boxes of pills. Somewhere in there, too, wrapped in tissue paper, was the long plait she'd cut off by herself with scissors when she was 16 because she wanted a Marcel wave in defiance of her parents. The sweet, stale smell of that drawer, face powder and wool and witch hazel, still had its mystique and suggestion of glamour for Rose's daughters. When they were children, they weren't supposed to go rummaging in their mother's things, and the dressing table had seemed a temple then, its back to the window, its bottle of Je Reviens by Worth, and its cut glass ring tray and jar of cold cream, the crocheted lace doilies set under the glass top, the heavy hinged mirrors sending their reflections jouncing vertiginously to the ceiling if they swung it, turning the room topsy-turvy. Doing Rose's lipstick now, Moira blotted her own lips together in demonstration, then stood behind her, judging her critically in the mirror, taking out her curlers and combing the fine, dark chestnut hair into waves, spraying to hold them in place. Their father's girlfriend was supposed to be much younger and good-looking, but in that moment, they were all three hopeful, fastening on the green necklace and the earrings, hearing him arrive home through the side door.
Beautiful, thank you. I mean, yeah, there we have, suddenly we have that plait. I believe, suddenly everything that's in the drawer is real, and that kind of quiet subversion of daughters loving their mother. They're frustrated with her, of course, but you know, so many mothers in fiction, the daughters scorn or despise, or it's friction, the relationships are. But in that one, that's a beautiful active love.
Yeah,
Lovely.
yeah.
Let's have. Can we have the house lights up a bit, please, so that Tessa and I can see you? And we have a roving mic. We have 10 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question. Sorry, if there's any way of doing the lights, I still can't see anyone. Thank you. Oh, we have some multitasking
funny about the
going
plait, by the way.
Perfect.
Oh, brilliant. Just to say, just a brilliant thing about that rag and bone shop of detail that one has. The plait was actually my mother's, so wrong generation completely, but always in my childhood, my mother had this slightly sinister plait wrapped in tissue paper that was her own hair.
Funny, I have a story that's going to be in Kevin Barry's anthology in a few weeks' time, and in it there's a flat, there's a sort of basement flat in Bloomsbury. It's only 2 rooms, like a living room and a bedroom, but more people live there than should. And it's that flat that my husband lived in before he was my husband, before I'd ever met him. And when I was writing that story in that magnetic way, I just took it. And I knew I was taking his flat, but I didn't care. I was amoral. My duty was to the story.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was that. It wasn't even mine.
Brilliant.
Funny the way that it works.
Finders keepers, I think, in fiction.
Yeah.
Though you have to be careful, obviously.
Who would like to start off with a question for Tessa? If you raise a tall, proud hand, so that we can see. A kind of tentative, wavering finger will do as well. Okay, brilliant. At the back here. Thank you.
You've both been very positive and endearing about all the lovely things that you love about writing. But are there any authors that you absolutely detest? Or maybe if you want to name names, some trends that you don't like.
Ooh, what a question to start with. Tessa, it's all yours.
Obviously, I'm not going to name any names. Do you know, it's funny, though, that sometimes I find myself so passionately disliking some writers that I think, oh, for God's sake, why don't take it personally? Don't they tried, you know? But it feels moral. It feels like I feel like I'm fighting on the side of the good. I can't stand that. Yeah, you're right. Dead authors would be a good idea, wouldn't they?
I think there's another way of answering that question, actually, which is sometimes you find a writer at the right time. Like, I'm so glad I read Laurie Moore in my early 20s. But say D.H. Lawrence, I loved his poetry, but I didn't properly read him until I was 40 and had had 2 kids. Until then, my only experience of D.H. Lawrence was going into the school library and opening Lady Chatterley's Lover on the bit that the spine broke and leaving it out for the librarian. But I was so glad that I read Lawrence as a 40-year-old who had children, because suddenly I think he would have been wasted on me as a 20-year-old.
Yeah. And you can read a book and hate it and then pick it up later and really, really think you were wrong. Or vice versa, which is much sadder, much more awful. That's awful when you think something was great. That doesn't happen very often. It happened a bit with Gordimer, actually, in that I lived my life through Nadine Gordimer, apart from being politically involved. But she was so important, and then it just went down. Is it Kingsley Amis, of all people? Probably somebody I don't like, but who talks about the trough after a writer dies, where your books sort of become irrelevant for a while, and then many writers never come out of that trough, but the good ones do. And her work just didn't fit. It was just out of joint with the time, with the politics, the spirit of the books, the sentences, and now I'm rediscovering them.
It happened with Bowen before Bowen was reclaimed as an Irish writer.
It absolutely did. Yeah. It did. Yeah, she sort of, even her novels written in the 60s, when she was in her 60s, they feel odd. And I imagine reading them in the 60s, they would have felt completely disjointed from everything going on then. Or Elizabeth Taylor, another great, not the actress, but the writer, another great writer, who got reviewed, in the 1960s as when there's Jean-Paul Sartre out there, who wants to be reading the tinkling of teacups? But then in time will tell, and I don't know how many people, probably a lot of people are reading Jean-Paul Sartre, but maybe just as many are reading Elizabeth Taylor now. So complicated. But no, one feels, Lucy was much more generous than me. I was actually quite vindictive, but one does feel angry with books that you feel are, sloppy or whatever. Wrong. Can't explain that.
Thank you. Here at the front.
And just I ought to say, one's so wrong about lots of things. That may just be, it's like the Brontes, like Charlotte Bronte was told she should read Jane Austen, and she hated it. She's just wrong. That's fine. The number of people D.H. Lawrence didn't like, in literary history is enormous. Yes. He was just wrong. It's fine. You sometimes, either as a writer or just as a reader, they can't do it for you, and that's also fine, and you're not right.
I always think Bowen hated Mansfield's story, Garden Party. Yeah. She could not stand that story. Yeah. But I have this theory that I've never managed to I've never proved or disproved it, but Bowen's story, The Demon Lover, it's about a woman who gets into a taxi comes for her, and the taxi won't stop, and taxis death, etc. But there's a passage in the garden party, that Mansfield story, where someone arrives flustered and he says, I just had the most hellish cab driver, he just would not stop. You think, much as Bowen claims to have hated that story, it got under, and she reviewed it very badly. Yeah, I've always thought something in it, she hates it in print, it got under her skin, and then, however many years later, she writes Demon Lover.
That's a
Mysterious.
brilliant, you need to write that down somewhere.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, over to you.
For the delay.
My question is, I suppose, do you think that women's writing has come into the mainstream? Do you think that women writers are now accepted as that the domestic situation is as important as other political situations?
That's such a... yes, I do. I even think possibly for a young white male writer now, it's probably harder to get published. But other things lie beneath that, and whether still there's a lack of value put on a sort of domestic realism, but am I just being defensive here? Maybe, as opposed to a thinking novel or an experimenting novel, that somehow is seen as a higher order, slightly more masculine. I don't know. No, I think women writers they reign at the moment in the West, in Britain. Actually, when I say the West, I'm not sure about that. Not sure it's true in France. Not that I know much about French culture, but I have a hunch. But I think in Britain and in Ireland, as far as I can make out, and in America. Lucy, what do you think?
I think, I'll use a personal example actually, Tessa. My friend, the writer Yenga, brilliant Chinese-born writer, I published her in Being Various, she was telling me about this awful literary festival she'd been to in Scandinavia when she was trying to express breast milk for her son, who was 3 months. And she was telling me that they said her event was going to be at 8 o'clock, and so she timed when she needed to pump this milk in the toilet so that she could go on stage. And then the drinks went on, the reception went on, and her timing was all wrong, and she was trying to work out, how do I do this? And I was saying to her, Yen, you have to write that as a story. And I was saying, I can't think of, and she wrote this brilliant story, and then she said that's called Stockholm. It's in her collection elsewhere. And the only other story that I could think of that was sort of about that breast milk and desire, and it was Tessa's story, the title story of Sunstroke, in which a woman, it's a complex story, and there are couples on holiday, and a friend comes who's unattached, and he seems to be pursuing one of the women and ends up kissing the other woman, and she's breastfeeding her baby, and after Yen had finished writing the story, she said to me, well, Lucy, you have to write me a story now. And so I wrote her a sort of sister story. It's called Cuddies in my most recent collection. But the debt is really to Tessa. Because that story, Cuddies, which is about, desire and motherhood and kind of subversive things, I wrote that because I knew that Sunstroke existed. And so I think that something happens where you see other writers, some writers are sort of like portals that you step through, and you see someone has done that, so I'm free to do my version of it. And so I think something like that happens where in the same way that we started off by talking about writers being made of other writers, stories are made of other stories. National stories are made of, and so I think something like that happens as well. Yeah. That maybe it ebbs and flows, but I think there's something to do with stories that haven't been told before. Yeah. Suddenly, when someone starts telling them, everyone thinks, "Oh, you can do that. I've got stories like that."
That's really interesting. Yes, and of course, one remembers that though there is a great tradition of women writers going right back to the beginning of the novel in England, with with Jane Austen, they were mostly unmarried and childless. It's just that's great, and let there be many more unmarried and childless writers. But the mothers who were breastfeeding didn't get to tell their story.
Yeah.
But there's another peculiar thing about realist fiction and that magnificent tradition that it is that lots of those men wrote women so brilliantly. I just want to put that in there because
Well, Tolstoy has the baby. He says that the baby's fat arm looks as if it's had a piece of string tied around it. And then you think, okay, well, Leo, you're leaving your wife and your 8 kids, and
I know.
But yet you capture the baby.
But again,
so
we are
perfectly.
not. Alice Munro was not great with her daughter. Tolstoy was much worse than not great. All of that. But then they put it down into fiction forever and ever, the look of a baby. I am literally, because I was travelling from Cardiff, so I got a long train journey and a ferry, I brought War and Peace. I thought that might last. And I've just read the terrible birth of Prince Andrei's son, I've read it before. Spoilers for those who haven't, that the wife dies in childbirth. And then they have this baby, and about a year later, his father and the father's sister, so the baby's aunt, the baby's sick, it's feverish, they're under the muslin of the hangings of the cot, and he's putting this big man who has despised women, he's said terrible things about women, he's putting his lips to the baby's head as his sister has taught him to tell the temperature of the baby. Exquisite writing lasting a page and a half about a baby. The men can do it too. Yeah. And they don't have to have been good or nice or anything.
Do we have one final question? Yes, over here.
Thanks very much, Tessa and Lucy, for a lovely conversation. I'm asking this question as an aspiring writer, because you're both writers and you're both teachers of writing. How do you manage the mundanity of your family life, writing, and maybe your job as well, and trying to give expression to your art when all practical things need attending to as well?
I think Lucy ought to take first answer to that. She has little children and a job and writing, so I've sort of come out of the thick of it into a different phase.
Yeah, I think that, some things need to slide, Like, my house probably isn't as tidy. I have to come to accommodation with the fact that I think of myself as a very neat and tidy person, and the reality proves otherwise. I would almost always rather be reading than anything else, I think the most important thing is you say aspiring. I would cut that out right away. I think going back to what Tessa and I said, if you're a writer, it's actually got nothing to do with publication or sales or awards, or that's the business of it, that's the kind of capitalism of it, that's all the rest of it. The actual being of a writer is that you need to do it. You have this compulsion for whatever genetic, spiritual, psychological, whatever bent, you have to absent yourself from the world and be alone in a room distilling fantasy and imagination and half-glimpsed things into prose in order to feel most in the world and of most use and most alive. And so I think that you, first of all, it's not aspiring, you're a writer at whatever stage of your writing journey. And then once you've done that, kind of like our tuning fork, you just have to let the rest of your domestic life and job and children and caring responsibilities kind of fall into alignment. Like when I was writing my stories and I was almost a full-time mom and my husband would take the kids for 2 hours, 2 mornings a week, I was completely brutal. We were in a small flat, it would be November, it would be completely pissing it down with rain, and I would say, I don't care where you go, you can sit and ride the Circle Line for 2.5 hours before you come back, but you need to be out of here. This is my time. So you need to, you're a writer, and then you need to honor that. And you need to, I'm sitting up straighter as I say this, you need to make sure that you have that psychic time and space. And you kind of need to think, it's like they tell you in an aeroplane, you need to fit your oxygen mask before you. So I always think, okay, so although I'm not there for my children.
I love that justification of the oxygen mask.
Yeah, it's like.
Don't save your baby first.
No, well you can't, right, you can't save your baby if you can't breathe yourself. You need to make sure that you've got the oxygen flow, and then you have more to give them.
Yeah, so true. And that, that is a revolution. That's a revolution. There really was a time when a man, it was Cyril Connolly, wasn't it, who said, the enemy of art and writing is the pram in the hall. Well, damn it, women now have the pram and the hall, and they get their husband. Cyril Connolly could go and take the babies onto the Circle Line so that his wife can write, and that's a revolution. Yeah. And hooray!
Oh, what a lovely note to end on. Thank you. Lovely question, Tessa. Thank you. Thank you.